It's a lot of flutter, a lot of things to disguise the fact that Ukraine has lost, that the US has lost, that NATO has lost. And as I try to put it, and this is not original with me, the pig of defeat needs a lot of lipstick to disguise that it's a real defeat. And in my view, Putin has made it clear through Lavrov and others, look, we got lots of lipstick here, okay? You just realize that we're going to make this as sensibly as possible a negotiated deal here.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to Ray McGovern, a former CIA analyst responsible for preparing the US president's daily briefs. Ray, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Pascal.
Ray, let's start with the address that President Trump and his Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, just gave to a entire what was that? Just hundreds of admirals and generals, right? A highly unusual meeting that they were calling. What is the news on this one?
It was an unprecedented kind of thing. I feared for what was going to come out of it. It's really not very clear whether those generals and admirals should have stood up and walked out. But I too was an army officer. I too took a solemn oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Now, that was a little while ago, and things have changed. But even Trump seemed to sort of think, well, nobody's going to do that here. Nobody's going to stand. So what he said was, look, he was nonplussed. He came into this audience, this big room, and nobody was clapping. Nobody was saying, yeah, 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 yeah. These were generals and admirals. They were pretty much silent. So he says, oh, I've never come into a room like this in years. Have some, you can applaud when you want. It's okay. And if you don't like, this is the key here. If you don't like what I say, well, you could just leave. And goodbye your rank and goodbye your future. Now, to Trump, that's very important, your rank and what he conceives to be your future. Um, the rest of us, at least back in my day, thought that rank carried with itself privileges and demands, and the first and foremost demand was to support your oath to defend and to defend the Constitution of the United States without against all enemies, foreign and domestic. One little footnote here. 20 years ago, when I was lecturing about how the intelligence on before the attack on Iraq it was fixed around the policy. And finally, someone showed me the minutes of a briefing of Tony Blair, and that's precisely the words they use. The intelligence and facts are being fixed around the policy. Be that as it may, I was asked to lecture at the Naval Academy in Annapolis to second and third year students. And we're talking about, we're talking about various things, and we're talking about oaths. And I just said, well, now, you all, when you joined the Navy, you took a solemn oath. Did you? Well, who was that oath to? And one guy, well, the president. Is anybody else? The president of the United States. Third, president. I said, sorry, folks, you took an oath to the Constitution. There could be times in your career where your oath to the Constitution supervenes over your orders from the president. Now, that was a wake-up call for me. I mean, that was the Navy. I'm Army. I try not to be prejudiced, but my God, these were people going to be naval officers, and they thought their oath was to the President of the United States. I don't know how many of those generals and admirals, it's about 20. Yes, many of them were probably there if they were from the Navy. I don't know if they got the message, but nobody got up Nobody walked out. I haven't read the speech in detail, so I don't see if there's any really probable cause as to whether they should have walked out. But that's the kind of lemming-like devotion to the officer, just one rank above, all the way up to the Joint Chiefs. And I mean, this is sort of making it a little fun, I suppose. But there are these two lemmings, okay, lemmings, and they're on the cliff. And one of them, all the other lemmings are just lemming-like, jumping off the cliff. And this one lemming says to the other, "Do we really have to do this?" And the first lemming says, "Well, if we don't do it, we'll be violating the spirit and the honor of all the lemmings that went before us." Boom. Now, my God, if that's the spirit, the esprit de corps that Trump was advertising as the reason for this meeting, and if there's still a bunch of lemmings in our office, of course, particularly at the top, not at the bottommost, but at the top, the ones that were in Annapolis when I gave that speech, we're in trouble deep. And of course, they're talking about turning the U.S. Army against cities and towns in our country. And that is, according to the Constitution, blatantly illegal.
Yeah. The danger right now is that the US forces are not only turned inward, but also outward in an unprecedented manner, right? And what you're saying is very pertinent because we already have now an instance in which the Department of War ordered the sinking and killing of the crews of 3 ships, right, in the Caribbean. 3 civilian vessels that are not in any way, shape, or form, not even claimed to be military vessels of a foreign nation. So we have the U.S. Army going after civilians, whether they're criminals or not. That's a second issue. But they're civilians, and they're supposed to be apprehended and not killed. And these kind of orders are currently discussed heavily in the US if those are legal and if the officers who execute them actually commit crimes themselves or if they can hide behind the chain of commands. What is your view on that one, on this sinking of these 3 supposed narcotic ships from Venezuela?
Well, Nuremberg made it very clear that you could not hide before the defense of "I was only following orders." Okay, that doesn't work. Okay, now what about Congress? What about the Supreme Court that's supposed to be exercising their own prerogatives with respect to the Constitution of the United States? Congress has just punted, just gone on leave about all this stuff. Was there prior warning to Congress as to what was coming? No. And the deed itself, those three little boats, not ships but boats, blown up by our Navy with these missiles or somewhere. There's no justification for that. Even if they were drug trafficking, even if they're human trafficking, you intercept them, you surround them, you arrest them, and you make sure that they're brought to justice. You don't just kill them. Now, this goes back to Obama. Obama, with John Brennan giving him a list every Tuesday of which terrorists had lunch with another suspected terrorist in this particular bar in Beirut last Tuesday. You put them on the top of the list. For what? For being struck down and murdered by drone. Okay. Now, when people said, "Now is that constitutional?" Eric Holder, who is Obama's attorney general, said, "Well, I'll go out and tell the law school at Northwestern University, a fine law school, by the way, I'll tell them about it." And he got before these people. He says, "Now, can we authorize killing to include not only suspected suspects, but like those 2 American citizens that we just killed 2 weeks ago? Can we authorize?" Of course we can, because if you look at the Constitution, it says we need to do that only with due process. Now we have judicial process. So judicial process allows us to do these things. The due process could be judicial process. So that's what and in my mind's eye, I had all these Northwestern law students, right? My God, this is really interesting. This is probably going to final, you know? So even the law schools don't object when things like this happen. The profession of law, like the profession of medicine, my God, where are the doctors on Gaza, the genocide there, and the legal people like the ones that justify torture and killing Americans with drones, and now killing whomever on these little boats. My God! So anyhow, the people in the Navy who followed orders to missile attack those small boats under ordinary circumstances, they could be charged with not just following orders, but with murdering these folks. I don't wish it on anyone. It's hard to refuse an ostensibly legal order, but the unified core of the Code of Military Justice does include, and if you are asked to do a illegal order, you have a right, you have a duty to disobey that command. That's what I would have done. Some of those generals sitting there before Trump, if they are asked to send their troops into, well, into Baltimore or into Knoxville or Nashville, what will they do? Will they say, yes, sir, and then worry about not losing their rank and their future? Well, most of them will. Maybe we'll see some people with the kind of guts that John Kennedy advertised in his great book, The Profiles of Courage.
Historically speaking, we don't have many instances in which armed forces, in the end, rebel against against illegal orders. We have them usually when that happens. It usually happens because the armed forces are treated poorly or not well paid when we have actual uprisings. But if you look at what happened in Germany in the 30s, if we look at how things went down also in the Soviet Union with the purchase and so on, there's just not a lot of chance. It just doesn't often happen because as soon as somebody doesn't obey, you have like 10 underlings who are very willing to obey if they just get the post. So we must actually expect that the armed forces of the United States will now be used inward and outward. What are you expecting from this talk that you've heard today by the president, where his most important focal points are going to be? On the one hand, we still have a proxy war with Russia that seems to be intensifying again, and Mr. Trump apparently said that he's very disappointed in Vladimir Putin because Vladimir Putin doesn't want to end the war the way that Mr. Trump wants it to end. But we also, everybody is currently expecting as a round two in the war, the US-Israeli war against Iran, and we have these 6,500 military personnel in front of the coast of Venezuela, or Navy personnel in front of Venezuela. Can you infer anything about Trump's priorities at the moment from what he said?
Yes, I can. But first, I'd just like to say that I spent the last 4 days in various parts of New York State trying to wake up people with respect to what's happening internally in our country. I quoted a person named Eric Hafner, as his real name was Raimund Pretzel, who was a young lawyer in Berlin during 1933, and watched the whole thing go down. Watched the Reichstagsbrand, the burning of the Reichstag building. And then what he was most horrified by was what he called the Schafsmäßige Ergebenheit. Okay. Schaf, sheep. Sheep-like Ergebenheit. No guts. Obedience, yeah. So, that's what I'm trying to, that's what a lot of us are trying to say. Look, to the military as well. If the president comes in and acts like the king and says, "Why aren't you applauding me? This is very unusual. I never have come into a place without applause. So if you want to applaud, applaud." Well, I fully expect there's some of these Schafsmäßige guys to start applauding right then. At least they didn't. Okay. So let's deal with that. That was really, really what happened in 1933 and thereon. That Geschichte eines Deutschen is really a pearl of a book. It's in English as well, called oh gosh, what's it called?
History of a German.
Yeah, the decline of Hitler or something like that. Anyhow, so let's see. I just wanted to put that one out of the way. Now, with respect to Ukraine, now I hold no brief for Donald Trump. I am incredibly embarrassed by small things like his disgraceful speech at the UN recently this past week, but much more irate at his enabling, his financing, his encouraging genocide. I never thought that I, an American citizen, would be part of a country whose president was pretty much aiding and abetting genocide. One telephone call would get Mr. Netanyahu to stop. Not only that, but forced starvation. I come from Ireland. Two of my great grandfathers escaped forced starvation. I have something in my genes, perhaps, but I feel very strongly about that. I think everyone should. So let's put Gaza in that context. Now, that's Mr. Hyde. There's a Dr. Jekyll and there's a Mr. Hyde, in my view. And this is a little bit of an outlier, okay? The Dr. Jekyll is the president wants to get the hell out of Ukraine, okay? He's embarrassed because it's taken so long and that it's so difficult to do. Shows a lot of naivete on his part. They could do it so easily. But I do believe he wants to get out of Ukraine. So he's worked out kind of an arrangement with the head of Russia, Mr. Putin, and Putin has been very cautious and generous, and Lavrov, the foreign minister, when Trump says, "I am very, very unhappy. I am very unhappy with Mr. Putin." Lavrov was asked about that during his post speech uh, press interview at the UN. He said, "Well, now people, express themselves in all kinds of ways. They have different ways of behaving. This is a kind of people have different ways of. What's important is what we hear in private, and the big thing is we're talking in private now. And we had this summit, and we're not going to take these grandiose things very seriously. Forget about it. Don't try to analyze everything that the president says. That's good advice. You know, I made my career on analyzing what Russian leaders said, and most of them were pretty consistent. But there was, on occasion, an inconsistent one, and you just had to wait for the next day to see if they would go back on what they said that day. What am I saying? I'm saying that Putin wants to get out of Ukraine. Does he want to take over all Ukraine? No, that's very clear. Much less does he want to take over Poland or the Baltic states. Now, when Biden said that, I couldn't believe my ears. I mean, just as a codicil here, when like Biden says, "Look, look, you think Putin's going to stop in Ukraine?" I'm not. Yeah, he's going to go in Poland and the Baltic states. You just watch. He's not going to stop. Well, I'll say very, very succinctly, he did stop. Okay. He stopped in March and April 2022, just 5 weeks into the war. They negotiated a stop, a ceasefire, and it was overruled by that clown from Britain, Boris Johnson, acting on behalf of the UK and US, who told Zelensky, ceasefire, forget about it. We're going to train up your troops so that they could do battle with these guys. We're going to give you everything you need for as long as it takes. So turn that thing. Especially, we don't want you to concede on Ukraine's membership in NATO, for God's sake. Don't give that away, for God. So now it's as long as it takes. Okay. So my point is, Russians stopped there. They withdrew their troops from around Kiev as a goodwill gesture, for God's sake. And then they were accused of some sort of massacre in Bucha. which has never been investigated and is very suspicious. So the Russians were branded as the really bad guys by Biden and the rest of them. But those who want to say that the Russians want to take all of Ukraine, well, they could if they want, but they don't want to because they don't want to be involved in another Vietnam, for God's sake. They were in Afghanistan. No, what was that like? They know it took us 20 years for our defeat in Afghanistan. They don't want that. So, in my view, Putin is willing to negotiate at the edges. I don't think he's willing to give back those 4 oblasts or Crimea, of course. But, there's lots of stuff on the edges. There's Odessa. I don't think Putin wants to have a firefight in and around Odessa. It is a beautiful city. It's Catherine the Great's crown jewel, for God's sake. Most of the people there are Russian speaking or pro Russian. So there are things that you can negotiate. The problem is Trump powerful enough within his little retinue of geniuses to meet to come halfway? Well, he's come a quarter of a way already. Remember, Trump was saying, "I'm going to put in bone-crushing sanctions. If you don't solve that problem in the war in Ukraine, we're going to sanctions and we give you 50 days to solve it." And then later, Lindsey Graham and the others says, 50? Okay, I give you 5 days. Okay, now 1, 2, 3. It's going to be the 4th day, and Trump is finally advised by somebody like Witkoff. "Oh, Mr. President, you're painting yourself in a corner. Number one, sanctions aren't going to hurt Russians at all. You want to put 100% sanctions on China? They're just going to thumb their nose at you. India? That's not going to be very good for India. So you got to do something. So what do you suggest there? Well, how about I go to Moscow and talk to Putin and tell him, frankly, we want to get out of this corner. We don't want to put sanctions on you or the other. So maybe we should have a summit." So he does. And Putin talks to him for 3.5 hours. And they decide, we'll have a summit. How long? In a week. And they meet in Alaska. Now, it was made clear to Witkoff that an immediate ceasefire is not in the cards. Okay, they're not going to bend on that. That's crazy for very good reasons. We know about immediate ceasefires and how people can build up their arms and everything else during the ceasefire. So Trump is on the plane going to Anchorage, and he says to a Fox News guy that he likes, "I'm going to be very unhappy indeed, if we don't come away with something in the nature of a ceasefire." Okay. That's what he says to this reporter. And of course, the report goes right out on the wire or wherever he called these days. And so he arrives there, and sure as can be, he made one last try with Putin. Now about immediate ceasefire. And Putin said, "Look, you know what "niet" means? Niet, niet. It means "niet" and no way." And so Trump kind of discussed other things. And then an hour after the meeting was over, he went to his keyboard and said, "Okay, we're not going to insist on an immediate ceasefire anymore. We're going to insist on negotiating the whole enchilada, the whole thing. We're going to come to an agreement that respects our core interests and the need for a different architecture for security in Europe." And we see eye to eye on that. President Trump wants us to get together. Well, he wants Zelensky and me to get together. We'll talk about that, but that doesn't seem like a good idea for lots of reasons. And then if the three of them we'll see what happens in the future. But we're negotiating now. We'd like to go back to Istanbul and negotiate with Ukraine, but they don't seem to be very ready. And meanwhile, we're doing this war of attrition, a trit, to the point where there's not going to be much left, if anything, of the Ukrainian defenses. Territory, we don't cover territory. What we're trying to do is what we said at the beginning. We're going to demilitarize the Ukrainian army. That means crush the Ukrainian army. They're about 85% there already. And the other task, of course, is denazification in Kiev. They're not close yet. So it's going to be a while. But what I'm saying here is that there are makings of a deal. Putin doesn't want to go all the way. Okay, they'd very much like to have a cordon sanitaire, a buffer zone. Okay, that will be wide enough to protect them from protect the Russians and the Russian-speaking areas from what they've been receiving up till now. So for Trump on Ukraine, I say go ahead, full speed ahead, see if you can work out a deal. Use people like Witkoff, who's about 10 times smarter than Rubio, and that's sort of damning with faint praise. I apologize for that. But get your head on straight. You're out on the right track here. And one should be able to discriminate between the Mr. Hyde on the Middle East and the Dr. Jekyll in the beginning, or on Ukraine. And why people can't discriminate is because of the Trump derangement syndrome. Everything Trump does, the media criticizes as illegal or not, or a lie. And so when I talk to my former colleagues from college, they can't see any of this. They think that Trump and they think that Putin and the Russians are evil incarnate, and it's really hard to get beneath that thick layer of what Russophobia, I guess you could call it.
Yeah, the difficult thing is to know what of the theater that we are seeing on the stage, when Mr. Trump is on the stage either talking to the generals and admirals, or when he's on the stage and talking to the folks out there who then do the clapping, or when he meets with Mr. Putin. I mean, all of this is a stage, right? And these people, including Mr. Putin, including Donald Trump, are highly aware that everything they're doing in that moment is being broadcast to their own audience and to the foreign audiences, right? So what's so difficult is to know what of that theater and charade is real and what is used as a tool also to negotiate with the others. Because Mr. Trump, on the one hand, has all of this talk, of course, of being a peace president and wanting the Nobel Peace Prize and so on and so forth. And he looks like extremely erratic, who just puts everything out on Truth Social. But if you actually look at the Truth Social posts and you compare them to the tweets in his first administration, you know what I see? I see no more mistakes, no more typing errors. I see like well polished, I mean, still Trump sentences, but they're polished sentences. There's no more and that they used the way that he used to have them. So we know that all of this is being actually worked on. And then we often don't notice what is not on the stage, right? So, for instance, Trump recently canceled a $400 million weapons delivery to Taiwan. He also now has, or would have, the right to station US troops in 15 Finnish military bases, but he doesn't. Except for one, the others are, according to my sources, not being staffed. They're not being taken over by the United States. Is there a whole shadow game also going on of like US-Russian negotiations of what this new border and this buffer zone will look like, or am I overinterpreting stuff?
Well, I think I would distinguish between Trump, who is by definition unpredictable.
Hmm.
This has to bother the Russian leaders and the Chinese leaders and everybody else. My God, just think we have the completely whimsical, unpredictable person with the codes to nuclear warheads. Now, on the Russian side, which is what I think which I've been following for 5 decades, the Russians are predictable, and you can read a lot into what they say and what they do. On Ukraine, the Russians they feel they've been tricked about 5 or 6 times in a major way. First and foremost, February 1990, when Secretary of State James Baker promised that, look, you let Germany be reunified, and we promise not to move NATO 1 inch east of Germany. Well, I don't know how Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, the foreign minister, how they reacted, but I can understand it. reunification of Germany. We just lost 27 million people to a unified Germany. That was a heavy pill to swallow. Now they trusted us, okay? So what happened was Jimmy Baker, smart lawyer from Texas, says, "Look, how would it be? Would that be good? We promised to do that, And now he's a smart lawyer from Texas. They didn't ask that it be written down. So all the better. Just have this promise, okay? Now, was it a promise? Of course it was a promise. And it's written down in all kinds of diplomatic literature, and it's available now in various libraries. But what am I saying here? I'm saying that trust started to be eroded then in a big way. When I was in Moscow, maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, I've been several times since. I met with one of Gorbachev's closest aides. His name is Kuvaldin. Uh, he was, when I talked to him, still a professor at the University of Moscow. He was his chief aide on these kinds of things. And over cocktails, I said, Mr. Kuvaldin, why is it that that wasn't written down? And he said, well, Mr. McGovern, I give you the school answers first. Germans hadn't bought in yet. I mean, it was a power term here, for God's sake. The Warsaw Pact still existed. But Mr. McGovern, the real reason is we trusted you. Okay? So, moving down from that, trust evaporated still more when we engineered a coup in Kiev. And I've had professors from Yale and elsewhere say, what coup? And say the coup that was advertised 2.5 weeks before it happened with the names of the coup leaders and respective prime ministers on YouTube. Look it up. First week of February 2014. And I saw that. And I said, oh my gosh, that means the coup is blown. We don't have to worry about any coup. And that was Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland talking to the U.S. ambassador in Kiev, And we know it's the genuine article. I mean, I don't know who intercepted it, but at one point, Jeffrey Pyatt says, the ambassador said, "Now, Ms. Secretary, Madam Secretary, the EU is not gonna like this at all." And she says, "Fuck the EU."
Yeah, she's very famous for that one, extremely famous. F the EU, Victoria Nuland, wife of neocon Archbishop of Canterbury, Mr. Kagan, right? So, I mean, these are this neocon faction of the United States who will do anything in their power to bring about chaos abroad because that's easier to manage.
That's right.
It was very successful in Ukraine, extremely successful, right? Including then having CIA bases all the way to the front, to the border with Russia, and we know all of that now. It's out in the open, but it still doesn't matter. The public discourse still pretends that all of that is the right of Ukraine to sacrifice itself for empire.
Yeah, well, you've got that right, of course. One could also mention that the same Victoria Nuland advertised the fact that the U.S. had invested $5 billion, billion with a B as in boy, to foster Ukrainian democracy. And the National Endowment for Democracy had about 56 sites in Ukraine. So my point is that here I'm talking on a progressive website. I'm talking with this Timothy Snyder from Yale, big professor there. And I say, well, the coup, he says, what coup? And I said, well, are you not familiar with the intercepted message for which Madam Noland has already apologized to her EU colleagues? Sorry, I didn't really mean saying F you. No. But have you not read that? And he looks at me and he says, is that all you got? So then I know.
Yeah, I mean, the smoking gun on the floor, and is that all you got, really?
Now,
that's
this
really
is all very consequential because Russiagate played into this shortly thereafter. And when Trump became president, of course, they emasculated him. They made sure they couldn't possibly reach out to Russia on false pretenses, namely Russiagate. So he was in a bind, and he had to be, as he read, I'm tougher than on Russia than anybody else. And then Obama, well, the whole bunch of them make hay out of being
Mhm.
Russophobic. So, uh, with respect to Ukraine, or with respect to how this came out, the coup was there. That was the second big betrayal. Then, of course, the Ukrainian military were worth virtually nothing, but they were encouraged to fight to put down those in, insurrectionists in the Donbass and Lugansk and Donetsk. And they did, and they started shelling cities and all that kind of stuff. So finally, there was an agreement to stop, ceasefire, and it was there were two of them in Minsk, Belarus, one in 2014, one in 2015. Okay, then part of that agreement was the Ukrainians would give the Donbass a measure of autonomy in their constitution to give them the rights that they used to have to speak Russian, to deal in Russian, official language Russian. It never happened. Who oversaw that? The French and the Germans. Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande. Now, for 7 years, they diddled the Russians, and Putin said, "No, no, we'll work through this. We help foster this. We'll get them." And they were diddled. Now, if further proof were needed, Angela Merkel just a couple of years ago said, "Yeah, we have to recognize that these Minsk Accords, we never intended to abide by them. The whole purpose was to build up the Ukrainian army from what it looked like then until, well, look at it now. It's one of the strongest armies ever. And Hollande said the same thing. So that's another betrayal. And then, of course, after the thing started, I think the very next day, Zelensky picked his best friend, Arachamia, to start negotiating with the Russians. And Putin picked a very capable guy too. They went up to Belarus. They came down to uh, Istanbul, and they came to an agreement. And that agreement was nullified. And then we got the last thing I just mentioned. This was a public betrayal, a public kind of bragging about this. The head of NATO at the time, Jens Stoltenberg, okay? Every now and then he really put his foot in his mouth. So he's talking to the EU Parliament, okay? This is 2 years ago. He says, the Russians, they they said we are going to invade Ukraine if you don't stop trying to get Ukraine in NATO. If you don't agree that we need to work this out. And we said no. And so he invaded to prevent Ukraine from going into NATO. But he didn't want NATO enlargement, and he got NATO enlargement, and got Finland, and we got Sweden. Now, by this time, Pascal, uh, over 500,000 young Ukrainians had already been killed. Okay, for what? And now we have, I think, over 1 million killed on the battlefield. And Trump is not getting the right figures on that if he thinks the Russians are losing more people than the Ukrainians. And the tide is so much in Russia's favor that when a harebrained guy like General Kellogg tells him, no, no, Russia's losing, Ukraine's going to just going to be fine. And besides, the Russian economy is foundering, the Russian economy going out. Give me a break. None of that is factual, but it's of a piece of what the intelligence people told Biden. Bill Burns, the CIA guy, uh, he goes, well, the president is in Helsinki. Um, so Burns says, now, Mr. President, you're making a speech. Just tell him Putin has already lost. His army has been subject to ridicule as completely inept. You tell him that, okay? So he does. Now, I'm thinking, where did Biden get that? And I found out it was just in Kiev. He was talking to Zelensky, and Zelensky said, "I'll tell you, President, we got it all made here. Everything's fine. You know, the Russians are losing and all this." Now, are people that gullible? Are people that stupid? Well, where was Kellogg when he made this last intervention? He just talking to Zelensky. Where was Trump? But he repeated it. He just talked to Zelensky. Now, does Zelensky have some sort of evil witchcraft that he imposes on these guys so that they can't see reality? I don't know, but it doesn't make sense. What really makes sense is the Russians are saying to themselves, in my view, look, Trump is Trump. We know his idiosyncrasies. We don't take them seriously, but he's the only guy we have to work with for 3 years, for God's sake. He seems more inclined than those other geniuses that we've had as president to do a deal. We're winning. He knows he's got to know that finally we have to do a deal with him because the alternative is to have to fight this war again in 5, 7 years. We don't want to do that. We want a architecture to prevent this. And we think that with other things on his plate, Trump might say, all right, well, let's work this out. What are you prepared to concede? And the Russians are willing to make some amends, some concessions there. They say so, you know. Not only do they keep saying that we're going to deal with the Americans no matter what they do, even if they join Israel in attacking Iran, fantastic. Right? They're very clear on what their priorities were. These are secondary issues. We're going to work with improving relations with the U.S. Are they going to succeed? They can't. Nobody can know because of the idiosyncratic way that Trump behaves.
Yeah. No, we have now this unfortunate reality where Europe and the United States are, to the most part, not completely, but to the most part, governed and ruled by solipsistic psychopaths, people who are completely engulfed in their own reality. Plus, they know that they're unaccountable for anything that they do. Therefore, they can do whatever they want. They can reign with impunity because, again, you can pull off a genocide against people in the Middle East, in West Asia, and it's fine. It's going to be fine. None of these people is ever going to go to prison for that. None of them, and they know it. And they care about their own profile first and foremost. You look at Mr. Macron, how he already is preparing for his next position in one of the international institutions. Look at Kaja Kallas, who she was like the prime minister of Estonia for 6 months when she was called to the EU and immediately said, like, get out of my way, you 2.5 million unimportant peasants, and went up there and now does her little solipsistic idiocy over there. But that is a reality. And I do believe the Russians by now understand that this is a reality, that they are dealing with basically with a wall of not only incompetence, but also irrationality. The question then is, how will the Russians approach this fact that they are being lied to time and again, that you can build no trust, and that you can't take anything serious that they're saying, right? And now the United States is actually saying, oh, well, maybe we will deliver tomahawks, right, to Ukraine. And we know that if any kind of tomahawk from Ukraine flies into Russia, these tomahawks are authorized, guided, and designed, and everything is designed by the United States. So I mean, I have no idea how I will deal with that, because it basically it decouples anything that's happening on the battlefield from the political talk on top. Do you have any hint of how the Russians are dealing now with this situation of this very, very horrible thing in the West to somehow have an intelligent conversation with?
Well, from the Kremlin's point of view, I believe they feel that they achieved a big win
Mm.
in Anchorage.
Mm.
Just the very prospect of Putin being received with such honors, and his talking to Trump for 3 hours and persuading him to cease and desist on this immediate ceasefire idea. Okay, then they're going to talk. They're going to talk some more. Now, uh, does Putin have inflated, exaggerated expectations? I don't think so. As a matter of fact, he has specifically warned against having inflated or exaggerated expectations. But he's going to wait this out. They're winning. He's under no real pressure to carry this thing in an escalatory way. Now, Russia's aim since I was a boy has been to split Europe, split Western Europe from the United States. Okay. NATO, when it was formed, 1949, I believe. Most people don't know. Well, they say, oh, well, NATO had to be formed because of the Warsaw Pact. Well, you know what's wrong with
Back in after, yeah.
Yeah, like 5 years later.
4.
Right. Yeah. So, so here's NATO being formed. And what was the express purpose of having NATO? Well, as Lord Ismay, the first head of NATO, put it, he says, well, it was to keep the Americans in, keep the Russians out, and keep the Germans down. No, you know, I was a child. I lived as a young boy for all of World War II, and keeping the Germans down seemed like a pretty good idea to me. I mean, I know a lot of Germans. I lived there for 5 years myself. I loved them, but I didn't want them to be reunited. It's a real sweet, very, very sour pill that James Baker served up. Now, of course, the quid pro quo, no enlargement of NATO. Well, NATO doubled in size from 12 to 24, and now is it 32 or something like it? No, 29, I guess, something like that. Anyhow, so now that was one of the big betrayals. But how is Putin looking at it now? Well, he's looking at the fact that Donald Trump, to all intents and purposes, has divorced himself from these, well, I call them the seven dwarfs. Picture them at the White House, Trump sitting behind his desk, assembling the seven dwarfs there that came there right after Anchorage, right?
Yeah.
And he's told them what's going to happen. I know, oh, they're all like that. So he's divorced himself from them. And what he said is this, and this is very, in my view, very easily explained. He said, look, as my vice president just said last week, we're done with Ukraine. Now, we, of course, want Ukraine to succeed. But you all are much closer to Ukraine, and you really haven't done your share yet. So here's the deal, okay? Here's the deal. We're going to make a lot of weapons, and then we're going to sell them to you. And then you're going to give them to the Ukrainians, and then we're going to win, okay? Now, the problem with that, of course, is we don't have any weapons. What? Our inventories are very, very low, and it's going to take us years to make the kind of weapons that might help. Okay, so when we get those weapons, the France, Germany, Britain, they don't have any money to buy the weapons. Okay, well, maybe they'll save up and buy the weapons. Okay, by the time they save up, buy the weapons and give them to the Ukrainians, well, the Ukrainians won't have any soldiers to fire the weapons. I mean, outside of that, it's a great deal. Okay, it's so outlandishly transparent. The U.S. is out of there. You smart guys, you geniuses in Britain and France and Germany think it can handle this. Well, we couldn't handle it for 3.5 years. Be my guest. That's what I think Trump wants to do. Now, he has General Kellogg and a lot of other really benighted people advising him and getting him to say ridiculous things like we talked about before. So he's got a lot of resistance. And the Russians are aware of that. They are aware that most U.S. policy decisions are made on the basis of domestic political considerations, and that's why Trump seems to want to bluster every now and then and say, "Oh, ARAMs, we're going to give them ARAMs. Oh, well, there aren't any ARAMs. They're not even built yet." So it's a lot of flutter, a lot of things to disguise the fact that Ukraine has lost, that the U.S. has lost, that NATO has lost, and as I try to put it, and this is not original with me, the pig of defeat needs a lot of lipstick to disguise that it's a real defeat. And in my view, Putin has made it clear through Lavrov and others, look, we got lots of lipstick here, okay? You just realize that we're going to make this as ostensibly as possible a negotiated deal here. We got some concessions, but look, don't think you don't think you have any really leverage anymore. And those seven dwarfs there in Europe, they don't either. So it's just a matter of time. The Russians, Putin has been incredibly patient. I mean, I have to say that, despite all these betrayals, some of which I mentioned before, he's still saying, I think Trump can be trusted. I think he is sincere. My God. Now, you mentioned tomahawks. Now, if tomahawks were as much as put on a freighter or something and tried to deliver, that would be the end of this new attitude. This is the reddest of red lines. You didn't mention it, but I'm sure you know that they could be nuclear tipped. They're cruise missiles. And so they hunker right on the land. They're hard to intercept. I think the Russians can handle them, but do the Russians want to have to be sure, number one, that they're not nuclear armed, or number two, that they can handle them all? No. And so if this happens, and I don't think it ever will, the Russians will be onto it right away. They will destroy those missiles as soon as they arrive anywhere near Ukraine. And I think Trump probably knows that. Whether the military knows that, or whether the military is going to be charging ahead on their own, as some people suggest, I don't know. But even then, I think I can compare. Well, I think I would compare Putin to be as perspicacious as John Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. One Air Force guy in his B-52 is flying into Soviet airspace, and JFK gets the word, "Oh my God, we thought this guy negotiating. Oh, what that happened?" And so he sits back on his chair and he says, "Well, there's always some idiot that doesn't get the word. No problem. Get in touch with Khrushchev. Tell him it was a mistake." So I think that Putin, in that respect, if there's a false flag attack, more than we're seeing over the last 2 weeks, Russian drones and all that kind of stuff, or Russian aircraft, if there's a major thing, the first thing you know, you'll have Lavrov on the phone with Rubio or with Witkoff. There's communication now. That's a big deal. There was none. There was none during the Biden administration.
Yes, that is absolutely true. So you're still interpreting this as a way of keeping the theater alive while actually under the hood putting the lipstick on the pig in order to basically let it go, let it go over time. And the Russians actually playing along with that because they know that this is the way to temper it down. Right.
People who think that Russia wants to go all the way to Poland, or they have trouble understanding what the Russian incentive would be. Putin very seriously doesn't want to go any farther west than he has to. Okay,
Yeah.
and there are physical barriers that have to be taken into account. And Lavrov 3 years ago, when he was asked about the West supplying longer range missiles, he said, "Well, look, that just means that we're going to have to move that farther west to take into account this longer range. That's all it is. We'll move from." So the Russians have the upper hand. They don't like the volatility and the unpredictability of Trump, but he's the only guy they have to deal with right now, and I think they see he's got lots of problems. He's losing support on his support for Netanyahu. Uh, why? Let me just add one thing here. How do you explain this overreaction to some small boats ostensibly carrying drugs from Venezuela? Okay. Well, I've been around a while, and I remember when the Marine barracks in Beirut was blown up, with something like 241 Marines killed. Okay. Now, that was a big black eye. And Reagan, finally, after using battleships to shell the Bekaa Valley, for God's sake, finally said, "No, we're bit off more than we could chew. We're getting the hell out of here." Okay. But they had to appear to be strong. And so what did they do? They launched an attack on Grenada. Grenada? Yeah, no, not Grenada. Grenada. Little island in the Caribbean. Now, What about Grenada? Oh, well, we had medical students studying there, and there was some leftist influence there, and they might take them hostage. Okay. And so we have to do something about that. And Weinberger and the rest of them said, we're sending the 82nd Airborne. We'll have a victory there. We can really pump our chests and say, well, that may have happened in Beirut, but we got Grenada, and there's no leftists or Fidel Castro followers left at Grenada to kidnap or kind of get our medical students. So I know that because I was there, right? I was dealing with those people. They knew there was no threat from Grenada. So what's the comparison? Well, we had to show something really strong when there was display of how the power in this world had shifted to Beijing. Okay.
Mm.
My God. Not just the parades, but all these people and China and India now, and most of the people in the world, and people just thumbing their nose at the West and saying, we got this taken care of. We got BRICS in Shanghai and all this stuff. Well, there was and Trump couldn't get himself invited, or just it was going real sour. So, in my view, they had a council of war and says, anybody get an idea like Grenada? Anything we can divert attention to shows how strong we were. And my guess is they picked these boats. I shouldn't laugh at them. These people killed, right? Picked these boats off Venezuela just to show what we can do. That was murder. And those officers that authorized that thing are as guilty as uh, whatever his name, Hegseth, who ordered it, because that's clearly an act of war. No act of war like that is justified.
No, but so your interpretation is that this is a show of force out of desperation because it's going down in Europe and the maybe also in West Asia. The war with Iran didn't. I mean, Iran was not defeated, right? This was another blow in the face of the planning, especially in Israel, right? And so is this, but this can still all go horribly wrong, right? Maybe there will be an invasion of Venezuela. I mean, who knows? Maybe there will be, like, especially missile strikes. We now know what missiles can do and drones can do, and, like, 2-year bombardment of Caracas. I mean, isn't that on the menu?
You're absolutely right to raise that. Venezuela, people say, has the richest deposits of oil and gas in any place in the world. That has to factor into this. Now, there's been a whole decade of trying to dislodge the Venezuelan leaders have been freely elected by their people. And who was that? I guess Maduro. They actually sent a drone up to take a shot at him when he was making a public speech about 5 years ago. So, yeah, they're out to get him and out to stir up a revolution there. So, I don't know if that's in the cards. Trump has enough on his plate now. What I think we should just say, emphasize is Iran, like you did. Now, Iran, all of my educated colleagues who know a lot bit more about Iran and Israel than I do say that an Israeli strike on Iran is well nigh inevitable soon.
Mm.
And I'm saying to myself, my God, are the Israelis that crazy? Because Iran has shown its capability with all their hypersonic missiles to destroy Israel. In other words, Iran has a deterrent. Are all these fancy air defense radars and everything going to work? No, they didn't. How do I know that? Because they didn't before. Okay. That's why Netanyahu asked Trump to say, well, let's have a ceasefire here quick because we're taking it on the chin. Not much is made. What happened to Israeli airfields and other key facilities during that exchange? So I'm saying to myself, my goodness, this would be a major war. And number one, would the U.S. be roped into this as Netanyahu is unable to do once recently? I don't know, but they have a lot on. Well, uh, in other words, really hard to predict whether our president could stand up to Netanyahu. What he could do now is say, don't even do it. Don't even do it. Because if I were Trump, I would say, look, this is going to happen. You're going to suffer retaliatory blows that you said you never suffered before. And then you're going to be faced with the possibility of being in extremis and having to use one of your nuclear weapons. And we don't want you to be in that kind of position, okay? Because we think you probably would, and we don't want that. So here it is. Don't do it. Now, I think, and this is not only my guess, there's evidence for this now. I think Trump is on various Epstein lists. I think Netanyahu has chapter and verse, blackmail material. Let's just say it on Trump. I think that's an additional impediment for Trump defying Netanyahu. Whether that's true or not, uh, Trump shows no inclination to say no to Netanyahu. If my friends are right, if there's an Iranian attack or Israeli attack on Iran, uh, the Iranians are going to retaliate as never before. They have Russia and China and the rest of BRICS. Iran is a member of BRICS now, supporting them. And the danger of a wider war is very, very great. And even more immediately, we have the danger of Netanyahu being in extremis and say, oh, what do I do now? Even the US can't bail me out. Well, I know what I'll do. I'll pull the temple down around me like Samson did, the Samson option, right? And I just won't let them, we'll let them prevail. And that way, not only do I not lose, but I stay out of jail. I mean, personal considerations enter into this because as soon as Netanyahu is not prime minister anymore, he's in jail. There are 5 suits against him, 3 of them quite airtight, and they have a bridal suite in one of the jails in Tel Aviv, all ready for Mr. and Mrs. Netanyahu. If he is dislodged, I hate to say that personal considerations like this could help justify genocide, forced starvation, and the possibility of using a nuclear weapon. But how else are you going to read Mr. Netanyahu?
No, I agree with you. I agree with you. It's this man is it's hard to find a more I lack the word. I lack the word to describe him. So let me not describe him. It's just utterly despicable what this person is willing to do. Unfortunately, it's not just him. Unfortunately, there's an entire system of psychopaths who are willing to take everybody down. But Ray, you gave me quite a bit of clarity actually on what is going on. So thank you very much for this. People who want to follow your work, I would direct them to your team, right? What is it called? Intelligence Officers for Sanity?
Yeah, let me just add one thing. A psychopath is right, but sociopath is even more correct. Look it up. I mean, just okay. Yeah. Well, my son, who runs my website, always gets really angry with me if I don't mention it. It's raymcgovern.com. He's made it a big effort to make it easily searchable, and that's where I put my stuff on record. Initially, I usually publish things on X. That's at Ray McGovern, and I also have my own what do they call it? Web Substack.
Substack.
I haven't really paid much attention to that except for the $50 a month I'm paying them. But I understand a lot of people see me that way too. I'm on Judge Napolitano's show twice a week, once Monday at 10, and then with Larry Johnson in the Intelligence Roundup Fridays at 4. That's where most people see me because he's got about 300,000 followers, no, subscribers now.
Half a million. Judge
Is
Napolitano is
amazing. That's right. Yeah, I'm behind the times here. So yeah, thanks for having me on, Pascal, and thank you for the good work you do. You have some really good people on, and you draw out really good stuff from them. So I hope this was no exception.
Thank you very much for the kind words. It surely wasn't. I really appreciate your input. Everybody check out Ray McGovern on his homepage, on X, on Substack, and certainly on Judge Napolitano. Ray McGovern, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Pascal.